All right, 5th grade, happy Friday. Today what we're going to do is we are going to talk about the second part of the 7 Years' War. Okay, so the 7 Years' War we talked about on Wednesday, kind of about what were some very main parts of that war, who were the different sides, and things kind of introducing you to this war. Okay, it really was the First World War. It was not World War I. World War I didn't happen to the 1900s. We're talking about the 1700s right now. But it was the first war that took place all around the world. There was fighting in North America. There was fighting in Europe. There was fighting in Africa, India. Just a lot of battles going on around the world. Okay, so we're going to jump down here to slide number 3. The first thing that I want to do is I know that on Wednesday we talked how there are kind of two different ways to name this war. There's the 7 Years' War and the French and Indian War. Okay? Now, both of those terms, 7 Years' War, French and Indian War, they both work. They're both true. But there's a little bit of a difference. Okay? So 7 Years' War, the war around the world. Okay, so the war that was around the world, so here's a map here that shows you all the different sides and the places that were being fought. That's a ton of places, right? It was all around the world. Here are a lot of countries, a lot of continents here. The 7 Years' War happened everywhere. Okay, now the French and Indian War was the part of the 7 Years' War that happened in North America. Okay, so here it is up here. This part is the 7 Years' War, or excuse me, the French and Indian War. Okay, so they're both the same thing. We just label it a little bit different. So the French and Indian War was part of the 7 Years' War that was all around the world. Okay, so the fighting took place in North America. Okay. North America is where we are today. Now, North America, here in 2020, is made up of Canada, the United States, and Mexico. But back then, we just called it North America, and it was all just one area. Okay. All right. So, that is the difference between the 7 Years' War and the French and Indian War. There's not a big difference, but there is a difference. Okay, so we'll jump down here to slide number 4. I want to talk about George Washington. Okay, you have learned about George Washington. You know that he was the first president of the United States. So right now our president is Joe Biden. The first president we had was George Washington back in the 1780s. But we're not there yet. Okay, we're not to the point where he becomes president or anything like that. That's in a little bit of the future here, in about 10-20 years from what we're talking about right now in the French and Indian War, in the 7 Years' War. So we're going to talk kind of about the beginning of George Washington's life, and I'll explain a little bit about why he's important. So first, he was born February 1732. Okay. And he was born in Virginia. At that time, it was a colony. It was not a state yet. It was the Virginia colony. Virginia is actually the colony, and then also it becomes a state. Virginia is a state in the United States that actually has the most presidents that were born there. Kind of interesting. Okay. An interesting fact about him, his dad was a famous painter. I don't think that he was like a worldwide, like world-renowned painter, but he was somebody who was a painter, and he was very prestigious. He was very good. He was able to provide a good life for George Washington growing up because he was a good painter. All right. He fought in this war. So the reason why we're talking about him today is not just for fun, but because this war that we're talking about, the 7 Years' War,
The French and Indian War was the part here in North America. He fought in the war. There's actually some legend. We don't know if it's 100% true, but there's a legend that in the very first battle of the French and Indian War, he shot the first shot. And he was actually, so we don't know if that's true. That kind of sounds like a legend, you know. It's hard to know if that's just, you know, George Washington is this living legend and everybody, you know, holds him and says, you know what, he was an amazing person and warrior. And so, sure, he shot the first shot in the French and Indian War. We don't know if that's true, but we do know that in that first battle, he was captured by the French. All right, so he was captured. He was eventually released, but continued to fight. And so he fought in the French and Indian War in the militia. Okay, now we will, before we move on to this last fact here, a militia, I'm going to give you the definition of what that means. That is something that we will need to remember because we're going to talk about the American Revolutionary War at the end of this year, and the militia, this word militia, is going to be used a lot during that war. Okay, so if you remember when we talked about 7 Years' War Part 1, the British Army didn't really send anybody to come help in North America, right? They mostly just said, hey, if you're a colonist, go and fight. Okay, so what a militia is, an emergency army made up of volunteers. Oops. I'm going to actually see if I can get a little bit darker. Okay, that's better. So an emergency army made up of volunteers. Okay, there are still militias around today. They're not really used. You know, the United States has a very big army, and so we don't really need volunteers, but there are still militias around. You can sign up for them. But during this war, during the 7 Years' War, really what happened was there were adults that maybe were bankers, maybe farmers, maybe they were painters, like George Washington's dad. Maybe they were just people like George Washington. George Washington actually wasn't a trained soldier. A lot of people think of him as this very good soldier, and he was. But really what he did was he was somebody who like looked at land and made sure that it was like ready to be sold. He looked at land and said like, hey, this land here is worth this much money. He wasn't a soldier. He was a volunteer. And he went and fought in this war to help out the king. Okay, so that's what a militia is, kind of like volunteers. So if I, Mr. Lund, was part of a militia, and all of a sudden there was a battle that broke out in Minnesota, and the army couldn't get here, and they said, hey, we need the militia to go help, then I would go and fight. I would go and buy a gun, I suppose, and go and fight. I am not a soldier, but I might be part of this emergency army that's made up of just volunteer people. Okay. All right. So, just one last fact on the slide here. We're not done talking about George Washington. We'll talk a lot about him later in the year. He's a very important person. There's a lot of other very important people as well, but we will talk more about George Washington and being the first president and why he was selected. He actually didn't want to be the first president, but he was forcefully asked to do it. We'll talk more about that in the end of the year. But one last fact that's kind of interesting. Back in the 1700s, people had a lot of children. All right, so it was very common for somebody to have 10, 15 children in their family. Right? George Washington is very unique because with everybody having a lot of kids and a lot of children around them, George Washington had 0 children. He never had a child. He never had a daughter or son. Which is not anything that you need to know for the 7 Years' War, but it is something that's very interesting about George Washington. When we think of him as such a leader, he never had any children. It's kind of interesting. Okay. All right. Move down here to slide number 5. So, 7 Years' War, we talked about how really what it was the French versus the British, right? Now there has to be a winner. Every war has a winner. And the side that won was the British. right? So the British won. They were able to force the French to get out of the Ohio River Valley, kick them out, and take that land for themselves. Okay. So now the last thing that I want to talk about for Friday today, before we go into the weekend, there were two main consequences of this war. We talked about them on Wednesday. We're going to talk about them a little bit more today, and why it's so important. Okay. So first, the war itself, it cost the British government, the king and the queen, it cost the British government 65 million pounds. Okay, so here in the United States we use dollars. In some Central America countries they use pesos. In China they use yen. That's what their money is called. In Britain they use the pounds. That's the little symbol there. It's the same thing as money. It doesn't equal exactly 1 to 1, but that's the kind of money they use. So the war cost them 65 million pounds. That's a lot. Okay? And back in 1760, when this was going on, that was a lot. But if you were to calculate that amount of money to how much it would be today, it would be $13 billion. Or, excuse me, not dollars, 13 billion pounds. All right, so just an insane amount of money that it cost. Because remember, they weren't only fighting in North America against the French and the Native Americans, they were also fighting in Europe, they were also fighting in India, they were fighting all around the world, and it was costing them so much money to send their soldiers around, to send weapons to the militias in North America. It just cost a lot of money. Today it would be, like I said, 13 billion pounds. Incredible, okay? So what that means, though, is to have that much money spent, the king had to make money and decided to tax the colonists. Okay? So the king had to make money, right? To spend that much money on a war, all of a sudden, you got kind of a big debt, right? And you have to make a lot of money really quick. And the king decided, you know what we are going to do? We went over to the colonies in North America. We had those militias fighting, whatever. We were on their home territory, so we should make them pay more in taxes. All right. Now, obviously, the colonists that were there that had to pay more in taxes, they really despised it. They did not like it at all. Okay. We will talk more about the different taxes and what they meant. But the king made this decision to tax the colonists a lot of money to make up for a war that they fought in. Okay. Also, I don't know why I said 1963. I have Watson's Go to Birmingham on my mind, apparently. So let me change this. Give me 1 second. So, sorry about that. I changed it. Proclamation of 1763. This was a something that the king said. He said, you know what? Here we are. We won the war. Congratulations, everybody. We did it. However, that land that we won, you can't go and live there. Native Americans live there, and we don't want you to go against them because that will cost us more money to fight. And we don't have the money to do that right now. Okay? So, what that meant, colonists were furious that they couldn't move to the land they just won, right? So they were fighting over this land against the French, and they won, and they said, yes, we did it. We got this land. And the king says, yes, congratulations, but you can't move there. Sorry. All right, so the colonists were furious about that. All right, so the people that live in the colonies at this point, they're mad about two things. First of all, the king raising a lot of taxes on them, and that they couldn't even move to the place they wanted to move. Okay, so let me show you a map here. This red line, this is the Proclamation line. This is the line where the king said, you cannot move past here. Okay, everything that was just to the west of that, the colonists wanted to go live on. There was a lot of really good land over there. They wanted it, but the king said, you cannot. And so there's two reasons right there why the colonists were super upset with the king. They did not like the things that he was saying or he was doing. Okay? And now a lot of things happen, and we will talk about that next. All right? Office hours 10:05. Otherwise, I'll see you at our meet time.